Between 1922 and 1937, in compliance with the Washington and First London naval treaties, Japan built no battleships. Like other countries, though, this didn't mean that designs didn't continue. As in other countries, various combinations of the three fundamentals of speed, armament, and protection were studied in earnest. In 1934, following their condemnation for the invasion of Manchuria, Japan walked out of the League of Nations. A few years later, Japan walked out of the Second London Treaty, no longer willing to be restrained to two-thirds the number of the U.S. or British navies, or to have the size of its ships and their armament limited. Buoyed on by nothing less than a sense of racial superiority, no less so than the Nazis, Japan continued on its goal to conquer and subjugate China, or again, like the Nazis, anyone else it considered genetically inferior. Realizing this agenda would ultimately lead to war with the U.S., the British Empire, or both, Japan began work on its new design. Even at this point, the mid-30s, Japan realized it could never outbuild or even match the U.S. quantitatively. So, carrying on the already established policy, it was decided to build qualitatively superior ships with the hopes that one of these would be a match for two or even three of its U.S. counterparts. So in 1937, after the expiration of its treaty limits, Japan started the namesake of the 5 ships of the 68,000-ton standard displacement Yamato class. In doing so, Japan assumed it had 2 advantages. The first was the Panamax, the maximum length and width of a ship that could fit through the Panama Canal. Japan assumed this would act as an artificial limit on the size of American warships. The second was the Second London Treaty before the Escalator Clause. This meant that as long as the U.S. adhered to the treaty it had signed, the maximum size of its battleships would be 35,000 tons with 14-inch guns. These were in fact the original specifications for the North Carolina class and the British King George V, which were laid down about the same time as the first 2 Yamatos. Keeping that 14-inch and 35,000-ton limit in mind, Japan came up with a design to totally outclass it. Main armament was a new 460mm 45 caliber gun. Unlike previous battleships, Japan's industrial base was now able to design guns this large on its own without foreign aid or enlarging previous designs, though actually building them was right at the upper limit of its industrial ability. So, as not to tip its hand, these guns were referred to in communications as Special 410mm, or just 410mm. As an indication of their advantage at the time works started, a typical 14-inch shell was about 1,500 pounds. A typical 16-inch shell was about 2,200 pounds, while their shell was about 3,200 pounds, better than double the 14-inch. To maximize weight, they were carried in 3 triple turrets. Like many other countries, they continued to have a secondary armament and a turretary heavy anti-aircraft armament. The U.S. and Britain had abandoned single-purpose secondary armament because A. treaty weight restrictions necessitated it, and B. fire control and technical ability made the medium guns, say 5-inch-ish, capable, or at least perceived to be capable, of being truly dual-purpose. Unhindered by weight restrictions, Japan retained the use of secondary guns. These were the new 155mm guns that were hoped to be dual-purpose, but I'll deal with that when I get to the Mogamis on which they were originally fitted. Turretary armament, aka heavy anti-aircraft, remained the same 5-inch 40 caliber guns that were quickly becoming standard on heavy cruisers and larger. With the exception of long-range battles, no torpedo tubes were fitted. They did, however, carry spotter float planes. Propulsion was of the standard steam turbine type. The level of armor was staggering, designed around the idea of rejecting 16-inch shells, the heaviest then in use, or even allowed by treaty, and a 1,000-kilogram bomb dropped from 15,000 feet. Another major advantage was their size. In fact, they were so big they actually had an elevator scaling the rear of the tower. Being about 18% wider than their American or British counterparts meant that what their TDS lacked in sophistication, it made up for in sheer depth. Their width meant they were extremely stable gun platforms. Despite how it looks, like previous battleships, they were not truly flush-decked. The forecastle deck ran all the way to aft of turret 3. It then dropped, but an external hangar deck was built over the quarterdeck for aircraft handling that was the same height as the forecastle deck. They also had the famous bulbous bow, a bulb at the lower edge of the bow which broke up wave resistance to give them more hydrodynamic freedom. For their spotter float planes, up to 7 could be carried at the stern. An intricate system of rails and turntables could be used to move the aircraft around for launching or for stowing in the below-deck hangar by means of a single elevator between the two catapults. Having had some varying discouraging problems with welding, I'll get into that more later, they were of mixed welded riveted construction. Still, Japan wanted more. Throughout the class, there was to have been progressive changes in secondary armament and armor. Of course, these ships were never completed or even started. Also not started was the follow-on class. These Super Yamatos would have been essentially slightly enlarged versions of Hull 797 with 3 twin 510mm, that's 20.1 inch, 45 caliber guns, and 460mm belt armor topped off by 250mm of deck armor. Theoretically, standard displacement would have been about 75,000 tons. The biggest problem I have with this idea is that the 460mm 45 caliber was right at the bleeding edge limit of Japan's industrial ability. I doubt they could have even made 510mm 45 caliber guns at the time. As for the ships themselves, remember, Japan's whole reason for going to war was its lack of industrial resources. Still, the Japanese were rightly proud of the Yamatos. They were very impressive ships. To many, they did, and do, symbolize Japan's ancient samurai spirit, and especially the military's strict adherence to the warrior's code of duty, loyalty, honor, and complete fealty to the emperor, Bushido. The only problem is, it was a complete lie. It all started with this book here, Bushido, the Soul of Japan. In short, its author put forth the notion that in ancient Japan, samurai were totally, religiously even, loyal to the emperor and by extension the government that served him, a basic foundation of Confucianism. The emperor was, after all, the biological descendant of God, or at least a god. The reality was very different. In reality, many decades went by where the emperor held very little real power and was little more than a figurehead. In reality, much like medieval knights, samurai weren't so much professional soldiers as mercenaries, usually hired by the wealthy landowners or daimyos to fight their wars with each other. The Code of Bushido was written by the daimyos as sort of a "this is how I would like you to act while employed by me" code. It rarely worked out that way. Again, like knights, or any other mercenaries actually, samurai weren't loyal to anyone or anything except their bank account. They didn't go to war for glory, honor, or out of a sense of loyalty. They went to war for booty, plunder, and the paycheck. It's actually stunning how many battles were decided when one side's troops wholesale defected right on the battlefield, often because the other side offered them more. Wow. So about 1905, along comes Bushido, the Soul of Japan. It essentially took this code of, "please don't kill me if my enemies offer you more," and passed it off as historical reality. Coincidentally, it went to press as the nation was coming out of isolation, entering the Industrial Revolution, and the government was trying to cement a centralized power that ran the whole nation. Now, you're running a country. You can either teach your soldiers, who are largely conscripts, to blindly follow orders and charge into battle yelling, "Banzai, long live the God Emperor," or You can teach them the truth, as they come from a long tradition of charging into battle yelling, "What's in it for me?" Not too surprisingly, the government couldn't get this book into people's hands fast enough, especially the military. So how did it work out? The timing shows. Let's look at one person as a case study. I choose Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, the second in command during the Battle of Okinawa. He graduated from the Army Academy in 1916, which meant he spent virtually his entire career taking this book as his Bible. In the early 30s, his mid-30s, he was part of the rise of the ultra-nationalists as they took or were given power. When war was started in China, he took part in the slaughter of, we'll just say, a lot of civilians. In late June of 1945, at the age of 51, as defeat on Okinawa was assured, he committed suicide rather than surrender. Considering the fate that probably awaited him at the war crimes trials, this was probably a good idea. Yamato was started November 4th, 1937 and completed December 16th, 1941. Musashi was started March 29th, 1938 and completed August 5th, 1942. Shinano was started May 4th, 1940. Work was essentially stopped in December of 1941 when 50% complete. Work started again to complete her as a carrier in June of 1942. As such, I'll deal with her whenever I get to the carriers. The unnamed Hull 111 was started November 7th, 1940, but canceled and broken up when about 30% complete in March of 1942. The unnamed Hull 797 was never started. Main armament was 9 460mm 45 caliber guns and 3 3-gun turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. Each mount weighed 2,774 metric tons. Maximum elevation was 45 degrees. Loading was at 3 degrees. Recoil was 1.43 meters. Rate of fire was 2 rounds per minute initially, with a sustained rate of fire of about 1.5 rounds per minute. Maximum range was about 42,000 meters. Muzzle velocity was 780 meters per second. Ammunition stowage was 100 shells per gun. Propellant was in 6 360-kilogram bags that could all be loaded onto the tray and rammed at the same time. Like other Japanese battleships, by this time, they fired 3 types of shells. The main one was a 1,460-kilogram armor-piercing round with a 33.85-kilogram bursting charge. The second was a 1,360-kilogram high-explosive or contact round with a 61.7-kilogram bursting charge. The third was the 1,360-kilogram Sanshiki anti-aircraft incendiary shotgun shell. Secondary armament on the first 2 was 12 155mm 60-caliber guns and 4 3-gun turrets, 1 superfiring turret 2, 1 superfiring turret 3, and 2 fitted midship, 1 on each side. On Shinano and Hull 111, the midship turrets would have been omitted. Hull 797 wouldn't have had them at all. Turretary armament on the first 2 was initially 12 5-inch 40-caliber anti-aircraft guns and 6 twin mounts midship, 3 on each side. Each of these mounts was enclosed to protect their crews and the equipment from the blast of the 460mm guns. Shinano and Hull 111 would have exchanged these for 12 100mm 65 caliber high velocity heavy anti-aircraft guns in 6 twin midship turrets, again 3 on each side. Hull 797, lacking the 155mm secondaries altogether, would have carried 24 100mm 65 calibers in 12 twin turrets. Propulsion was provided by 12 boilers venting to 1 funnel. These provided steam to 4 turbines that generated 150,000 horsepower to directly drive the 4 propellers for a top speed of 27 knots. They had 1 rudder. Protection was mostly all or nothing. The main belt was 410 millimeters, reduced to 400 millimeters in Shinano and on, starting at the waterline and sloped inward 20 degrees from top to bottom. Below the main belt was the lower belt that was 270 millimeters besides the magazine and 200 millimeters besides the engine spaces that sloped inward 15 degrees from top to bottom and reduced down to 75 millimeters as it joined the outer shell of the double bottom. Above the main belt and running up to the main deck, armor was 37 millimeters. The ends of the armored box were formed by bulkheads 300 millimeters thick forward of turret 1 and 270 millimeters thick aft of turret 3. Behind the armored citadel, 360 millimeters protected the main steering gear and 300 millimeters protected the auxiliary steering gear. Barbette armor was 560 millimeters on the sides, 380 millimeters on the front and back, and 80 millimeters on the floors. The turrets were 270 millimeters on the roofs, 250 millimeters on the sides, and 650 millimeters on the front. The secondary 155 millimeter turrets had 50 millimeters of armor. Conning tower armor was 500 millimeters. The main deck was 35 millimeters, increasing to 50 millimeters over the magazines and engine rooms, and was mostly there to detonate any hits before it got into the ship's vitals. As with other battleships, the armored deck wasn't the main deck, but rather the third deck down. This was 200 millimeters, decreased to 190 millimeters in Shinano and all, increasing to 380 millimeters around the boiler vents. At the sides, over the TDS, it thickened to 230 millimeters and sloped downward to meet the top of the armored belt. Below the armored belt, in the area of the armored citadel, was a 90 millimeter splinter deck to keep any shrapnel out of the ship's vitals. The TDS was essentially 4 layers, not as many as the older American ships, but much deeper. The outer 2 layers were a bulge that ran from the keel up to the waterline and stretched from turret 1 to turret 3. Next came the main and lower belt that formed the holding wall between the second and third layers. Behind the belt and inside the hull proper was 2 more layers with a 14 millimeter wall dividing them. The 12 boilers were divided into 3 lateral rooms sitted front to back, each with 4 boilers. Each boiler was in its own subcompartment. Behind the boiler rooms were the 2 lateral turbine rooms that sat front to back. The forward room housed the turbines that ran the inner propellers, while the rear one housed the turbines for the outer ones. A double bulkhead ran the length of the ship, except through the magazines, of course, essentially cutting the ship in half. In the engine rooms, this acted to cut the 3 boiler rooms into 2 rooms of 2 boilers and essentially put each turbine in its own compartment with the pipes that ran steam from the boilers to the turbines and back again, as well as smoke running up to the stack, as well as main electrical cabling between them. They were double-bottomed. 7 float planes at maximum could be carried, but in practice rarely no more than 4 ever were. Modifications were relatively light. Shortly after completion, in September of 1942, Musashi was fitted with the new Type 21 radar. In mid-July of 1943, Yamato was fitted with the Type 21 radar, and the armor on her beam 155 mm turrets was thickened to 103 mm. At about the same time, Musashi was fitted with the Type 22 radar. In late February of 1944, Yamato exchanged her 2 midship 155 mm turrets for 6 more twin 5-inch 40 caliber heavy anti-aircraft mounts, 3 on each side, and the Type 13 and 22 radar. In early April of 1944, Musashi traded her midship 155 mm mounts for 6 triple, 3 on each side, medium anti-aircraft mounts. Originally, it had been hoped to give her more 5-inch 40s like her sister, but the mounts weren't available. At the same time, she too was fitted with the Type 13 radar. Of course, throughout their lives, light and medium anti-aircraft was continuously increased. Yamato was commissioned December 16, 1941, and began fitting out. In mid-February 1942, she became the flagship of the combined fleet. With the oil shortage that caused the war worse than ever, and being held in reserve for the great decisive battle, even as VIPs came and went through her elegantly decorated hull, she was soon dubbed Hotel Yamato. In late May of 1942, she finally set sail with the main body to take part in the Battle of Midway. She saw no action in the battle. Returning to Japan in mid-June, she resumed training and standby. At the beginning of August 1942, Musashi entered the fleet and promptly joined her sister guarding the pier. In mid through late August 1942, Yamato sailed to Truk so that the combined fleet's headquarters could be closer to the front lines in the Solomons. There she stayed until early May of 1943. In mid to late January 1943, Musashi sailed to Truk to join her sister. Returning to Japan in mid-May 1943, Yamato underwent refit and inspection until mid-August. Also in mid-May, Musashi, still carrying Admiral Yamamoto's ashes and other large ships, left Truk and headed to Japan to form a force to oppose the American liberation of Attu. Arriving in Japan on May 22nd, Yamamoto's ashes were sent ashore for a state funeral, and the counter-invasion force prepared to sail. But before they could, Attu fell, so the operation was called off. Departing Japan again for Truk at the end of July, Musashi arrived a few days into August. Loaded with troops and supplies in mid-August, Yamato again left Japan for Truk, arriving near the end of the month. While Musashi was left behind, in mid-September, Yamato sailed with most of the heavies to try to intercept American carriers raiding the Marshalls and Gilberts, but arrived too late and returned to Truk at the end of the month. In mid-October 1943, both ships sailed with the fleet to try to intercept American carriers raiding Wake, but again came up empty and returned to Truk at the end of the month. In mid-December 1943, while Musashi stayed at Truk, Yamato returned to Japan to support a troop convoy and headed back to Truk. Just north of Truk on December 25th, Christmas, Yamato was hit outboard of Turret 3 on the starboard side by a submarine torpedo from USS Skate. The damage was bad, far worse than would have been expected of a single hit. A 15 by 75 foot hole was blown in the bulge, and the joint where the main and lower belts meet rent due to being too stiff to absorb the shock of the blast. As a result, the upper magazine of Turret 3 was flooded, and the ship took on a list to starboard. She soon arrived at Truk and started temporary repairs, faith in her invulnerability badly shaken. In mid-January 1944, she sailed back to Japan for permanent repairs and upgrades. In mid-February, Musashi left Truk for Japan, as Truk's defensibility was obviously becoming untenable. Loaded with supplies and troops, Musashi then left Japan and headed to Palau to reinforce the garrison there. A month later, on March 29th, Musashi was leaving Palau when she too was hit by a torpedo from the submarine Tunny, which blew a 19-foot hole in her port bow. Returning to Japan for repairs and upgrades, she arrived in early April. In mid-April, the now repaired and upgraded Yamato loaded troops and supplies and ferried them to Manila, then continued on with most of the heavies to their new base in the East Indies. In mid-May, with her repairs and upgrades completed, Musashi ferried supplies to Okinawa, then continued on to join Yamato and the rest of the fleet in the East Indies. In mid-June of 1944, along with most of the fleet, they sailed to take part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Undamaged, they returned to Japan at the end of the month. Again departing Japan at the start of July, they ferried troops and supplies to Okinawa before again continuing on to the East Indies, arriving there mid-month. There they remained until October 20th, when, along with the rest of the heavy units, they departed for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In the Sibuyan Sea, Yamato was hit by several bombs. Two exploded on the roof of turret 1. Another hit the bow and exploded under the waterline, causing her to trim down. Another hit the port just aside turret 1, causing miter flooding. Another punched through the crew's quarters. The damage was minor, and despite a 5-degree list that counter-flooding corrected, Yamato continued on. Musashi wasn't as lucky. Hit or near-missed by about 17 bombs and about 20 torpedoes, mostly near the bow, at about 7:30 p.m., she rolled over to port and sank bow first, her magazines detonating as she went down. The next morning at the Battle of Samar, Yamato fired a few times before churning north with Nagato to avoid a torpedo. A few hours later, at the Battle of Tablas Strait, as the force retreated, it was attacked again. 2 bombs hit Yamato, again both forward. One hit the side of turret 1, and the other hit the forecastle. The damage again was minimal. By the end of the month, she was back in the East Indies. A few weeks later, in mid-November, along with most of the heavy units, she sailed to Japan for repairs and refit, arriving near the end of the month. With repairs completed but no fuel or air cover, she essentially stayed in Japan, weathering one air raid after another until April 6, 1945, when she finally sailed as the heart of the Tenichigo Force. Bound for Okinawa, her orders were to attack the amphibious assault forces, ground herself on the island, and act as a beached fortress where her sailors could join the defense of the island. Not so much of a kamikaze mission, it was really a banzai charge. Few on board were optimistic about her chances in light of American qualitative and quantitative superiority, both in the air and on the surface. At 12:30 on April 7th, the first of several waves of American aircraft began their attack. Despite all of her anti-aircraft guns, it could only go one way. Throughout the attack, a theme developed. Dive bombers and fighters hit the ship first to wipe out her anti-aircraft gunners. Then, the torpedo planes came in and punched holes in her port side. It was a well-coordinated, methodical operation. At about 2:30 p.m., she finally rolled over to port, and her number 1 magazine exploded as she went down. As this diorama shows, the wreck landed in 2 pieces. The rear part lays upside down, while the blown-off bow lays essentially right side up.